Harold Williams was born and raised in a small town in southern Oklahoma. All who knew him described him as a quiet, respectable man who always kept to himself, but was respected in his community. Harold was a war veteran who proudly wore his medals and participated in local community events. His home, located on the outskirts of town, always seemed neat and tidy. Neighbors knew that he lived alone after the death of his wife, who had died 10 years earlier. Their marriage had been long, but according to those who knew the couple, childless. However, suddenly, in 2008, a young man appeared in his life. Mark, Harold's grandson, who was the son of his long-departed son. Mark was only 19 years old when he moved in with his grandfather. His parents' divorce and subsequent unstable life led to him needing stability and support. Harold willingly offered him shelter and promised to care for him, as a grandfather to a loving grandson. At first glance, it was a normal decision for a family trying to support each other in difficult times. However, behind this seemingly simple gesture, there was a story much darker than anyone could have imagined. No one knew that Mark's life was about to turn into a nightmare that would soon change not only his fate, but also the peace of the entire city. The neighbors quickly got used to young Mark's presence in Harold's house. They often saw him mowing the lawn or helping his grandfather with the housework. However, no one could help but notice that Mark rarely interacted with anyone in the neighborhood. He was avoided at school, and those who tried to talk to him soon realized that the boy was extremely withdrawn and silent. People attributed this to the difficulties of adolescence, but in reality, it was much more complicated. Mark became more and more absorbed in his own thoughts and experiences. Soon his behavior began to arouse suspicion in those who even slightly observed his life. He was often absent at night, returning home in the early morning. No one knew where he was or what he was doing during this time. Even more disturbing was the fact that Harold began to behave strangely. He no longer took part in social life as actively as before and spent more and more time at home with Mark. Despite all this, no one in the town suspected that something terrible was happening behind the closed doors of this seemingly ordinary house. Harold and Mark lived as if in a parallel reality. Their lives were full of secrets and hidden problems that no one could even guess about. Mark began to withdraw into himself more and more, and Harold seemed like a person whose role in this process was much deeper than anyone could have imagined. Thus began a dark story that would soon lead to events that would shake the entire community. It all began with small things, but soon the tension in the Williams household grew, and the world they had created for themselves began to crumble. Behind the facade of a quiet life lurked passions and violence that no one could have predicted. Over time, the odd behavior of Mark and Harold became increasingly obvious to those around them, although none of the residents of the small town dared to speak about it out loud. Neighbors noticed that Mark and Harold spent almost all their time together. Their joint walks, dinners, and trips to the city initially did not arouse suspicion. The grandfather took care of his grandson, helping him recover from a difficult period in his life. However, against this background, questions began to arise, especially among those who lived nearby and had the opportunity to observe them more closely. Mark, who was initially perceived as an ordinary young man, quickly stopped communicating with those around him. He rarely left the house, did not attend school, and seemed uninterested in anything that was going on around him. Even those who tried to talk to him, neighbors or classmates, noticed that his gaze was full of anxiety, and his communication was limited to monosyllabic answers. Many attributed this to the difficulties associated with moving and his parents' divorce, but no one dug deeper. Some neighbors, however, like Mrs. Jenkins, who lived across the street from Harold's house, did notice more than others. She often saw them together, grandfather and grandson, leaving the house early in the morning or returning late at night. But one event in particular alarmed her. Late one evening, Mrs. Jenkins was sitting by the window when she saw Mark and Harold walking home. It wouldn't have been so strange if it hadn't been for the way they were acting. She noticed that Mark walked next to Harold with his head down, and his body seemed tense. Harold, on the other hand, seemed unusually calm, even commanding. Mrs. Jenkins couldn't shake the strange feeling that something was wrong. As time went on, the oddities in their behavior became more and more obvious. They stopped going out together. Mark was now spending more and more time indoors, and when he was seen out, he seemed depressed and withdrawn. Neighbors began to wonder, what was going on in this house? Particularly alarming was the fact that Mark, who had previously occasionally socialized with other children, stopped appearing out. Mrs. Jenkins told her husband about her observations, but he simply brushed it off, advising her not to interfere in other people's affairs. The alarm in the community was growing, but no one could have guessed that something terrible was happening behind the closed doors of the Williams house. No one knew that the relationship between Harold and Mark was no longer just that of grandfather and grandson. Under cover of night and in the shadow of his own home, Harold began to use his influence and power over Mark, which would soon lead to tragedy. Mark, increasingly confused by his emotions and experiences, became even more withdrawn. He was afraid to share what was happening, even with the few who tried to pay attention to him. His internal conflict grew stronger with each passing day, and the feeling of fear and despair overwhelmed him more and more. Every time he tried to resist, Harold pressed him even harder, convincing him that no one would understand him, that no one needed him. This created a real emotional vacuum around Mark, from which there seemed to be no escape. The atmosphere in the house became increasingly tense. Silence became the only way for them to communicate. Mark felt like a prisoner in his own home, and Harold, the one who had complete control over his life. Mark's fear only increased with each passing day, and his only consolation was complete submission to his grandfather. However, this was only a temporary solution, and soon the tension in their relationship would reach the point of no return. On the surface, everything continued to appear normal. Harold continued to take care of the house, maintain his outward calm, and even occasionally interact with his neighbors. But behind these simple actions lurked a deep, dark secret that no one could see. Over time, events in the Williams home would take such a turn that the entire community would be shocked by what would soon come to light. Over time, Mark and Harold's strange behavior became more and more noticeable to those around them. One cold evening, when the city was quiet, Mrs. Jenkins, the same neighbor who had been watching the Williams family with concern, witnessed something unusual again. She stood at the window of her house and saw Mark returning home, but this time not with his grandfather, but alone, and he was clearly agitated. His steps were quick and hesitant, as if he were trying to hide from something or someone. However, when he approached the door, Harold was already standing on the porch, as if expecting his return. Their short conversation, which Mrs. Jenkins could not hear, seemed forced. And soon, Mark abruptly entered the house and Harold closed the door without looking back. The scene was deeply etched in Mrs. Jenkins's mind. She began to wonder what was going on behind the closed doors of the Williams house. Her anxiety grew, especially after she tried to approach Mark in the street the next day and talk to him. She invited him in for tea, as she had done with many of the neighborhood teenagers. But Mark had coldly declined, muttering something unintelligible, and hurried away. This was not at all like the people she knew, and her intuition told her that this was more than just teenage troubles. Gradually, other neighbors began to grow suspicious. One of them, Thomas, who sometimes helped Harold with home repairs, noticed that Mark had almost stopped going outside. Once a cheerful teenager, he now looked depressed. His eyes were always full of worry. Thomas tried to talk to Harold, asking about Mark, but in response he received only short phrases and evasive answers. Harold assured him that everything was fine, that Mark was simply going through a difficult period in his life after his parents' divorce. However, something told Thomas that the situation was much more serious than just family problems. Soon, another incident occurred that made the locals wonder what was going on. One night, around midnight, the neighbors heard screams coming from the Williams house. It was something strange and frightening. The voice sounded like someone was calling for help. Thomas, awakened by the noise, ran outside, trying to understand what was happening. But that night, no one came out of the house. In the morning, when everything was quiet, Harold appeared on the porch again, as if nothing had happened, calmly watering the flowers near the house. When the neighbors began to carefully question him about the night screams, he simply brushed them off, saying that it was Mark's dream, who was screaming in his sleep. However, this explanation did not satisfy those who heard the sounds. The screams were too obvious, too real to be written off as a nightmare. People began to whisper among themselves, discussing what could be happening in the house. However, despite all the suspicions, no one dared to do anything serious. The locals, although wary of the situation, still respected Harold, considering him a worthy man. But one event was the real turning point. A few weeks later, Mrs. Jenkins saw Mark again in the street. This time, he looked even more haggard and haggard. She noticed that he had a bruise on his arm and obvious marks of beatings under his eye. This shocked her, and she immediately tried to approach him, but Mark quickly disappeared into the house again. This incident was a turning point for Mrs. Jenkins. She knew that things were getting serious. Unable to bear the tension, she turned to the local sheriff, deciding that something had to be done. The sheriff, a man of great experience, listened to her story, but treated it with a certain amount of skepticism. He felt that Mrs. Jenkins was spending too much time watching her neighbors and that her suspicions might be exaggerated. However, he promised to check the situation and talk to Harold. But that's where it all stopped. The sheriff, visiting Harold, was met by a calm, self-confident older man who assured him that there was no threat and that Mark was simply going through a difficult period in his life. Harold even invited the sheriff into the house to show that everything was in order, and he, not noticing anything suspicious, decided not to delve into the matter. But Mrs. Jenkins couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was coming. She kept watching the house, trying to understand what was happening behind those walls. Her intuition told her that this was only the beginning, and soon the truth would come out, but when and how, no one could predict. As time went on, the tension around the Williams home continued to mount. Mrs. Jenkins couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was happening behind closed doors. Every time she saw Mark or Harold, she felt an uneasy feeling, as if her own consciousness was screaming at her to find out the truth as soon as possible. However, no one wanted to interfere in other people's business, and the police, after a short visit from the sheriff, decided that the incident did not require further investigation. It soon became noticeable that Mark had almost completely stopped leaving the house. His rare appearances on the street were accompanied by even greater alertness and fear in his eyes. The neighbors could only guess what was going on inside, but most still preferred not to discuss the topic openly. However, rumors began to spread throughout the city. Whispers on the streets, full of anxiety and suspicion, surrounded each new case of Mark or Harold appearing. One day, early in the evening, Mark finally left the house. It was rare. So many people noticed him right away. He walked quickly, as if trying to escape from something. His face was pale, and his gaze darted around, as if he was afraid of being followed. Mark moved along the narrow streets of the city, trying not to catch the eye of his acquaintances. He was heading to the outskirts, to an old abandoned barn that the locals had long since stopped visiting. The barn had a dark history. It had once been used for farming, but over the years it had been abandoned and left to its own devices. Now it was surrounded by legends and rumors, and the kids in town avoided the place. Mark, however, was clearly heading there with a purpose, as if he knew he could find something or someone he needed there. At that moment, Mrs. Jenkins, sitting on her porch, saw him by chance and felt an inexplicable impulse to follow him. She, of course, understood that it could be dangerous, but her intuition did not leave her alone. Hiding in the shadows of the houses, she followed Mark, not taking her eyes off him. As they approached the barn, the feeling of anxiety increased. When Mark finally reached the barn, he looked around to make sure no one was watching him, and quietly walked inside. Mrs. Jenkins held her breath. She came closer and saw that the barn doors were slightly open. She quietly walked to the window where she could look inside. What she saw shocked her. Inside, Harold stood on the dirt floor of the barn. His face was grim and tense, his voice menacing. He was speaking to Mark, who looked depressed and afraid. Harold gestured sharply toward something in the corner of the barn, and Mark obediently walked toward it, his head down. The scene itself was not overtly violent, but something about the setting was terrifying. Harold's words were barely audible, but their tone and intonation spoke of the complete control he had over his grandson. Mark stood before him like a broken man with no hope of salvation. Mrs. Jenkins couldn't believe her eyes. She knew she was seeing something terrible, but fear paralyzed her. She couldn't figure out what was happening, but it was obvious this was no ordinary family conversation. Harold was pressuring Mark, and something in his behavior betrayed ulterior motives. Mark, as if sensing that he was being watched, turned sharply, and their gazes met for a split second. Mrs. Jenkins froze, afraid that he would notice her, but Mark quickly looked away, as if he were even more frightened. Harold continued to talk to him, not paying attention to what was happening around him. A feeling of horror and helplessness overwhelmed Mrs. Jenkins. She did not know what to do. On the one hand, she realized that interfering in the situation could be dangerous, but on the other hand, her sense of justice demanded that she act. She had ample reason to suspect that dark deeds were going on in the Williams house, but a direct confrontation with Harold seemed too risky. That night, Mrs. Jenkins was unable to act. She returned home shaking with fear and anxiety, realizing that she had just witnessed something truly terrifying. Her mind was full of questions. What was Harold forcing Mark to do? Why were they meeting in this abandoned barn? And most importantly, what else was hiding behind the facade of their normal life? After a night of worry and sleeplessness, Mrs. Jenkins could not shake off the nagging feeling that she had witnessed something terrible. The shadows that enveloped the Williams house seemed to be growing thicker, and her heart sank every time she saw Mark or Harold. Despite all her doubts and fears, she was hesitant to contact the police again. Her previous appeal had yielded no results, and she was not sure that she had enough evidence to arouse the authorities' real interest. Meanwhile, inside the Williams household, the situation was growing increasingly tense. The relationship between Mark and Harold had become incredibly tense. Every day for Mark was becoming a struggle for survival, not a physical one, but a psychological one. Harold seemed increasingly impatient, and his control over his grandson was becoming more and more aggressive. Any attempts by Mark to express his dissatisfaction or to try to distance himself from his grandfather were met with stiff resistance. Violence began to erupt in the house. It began with screams that neighbors could hear at night. Often it was Mark's voice, as if he were calling for help or expressing his pain. But as soon as anyone approached the house, everything would subside. Harold seemed to be able to quickly suppress any outward manifestations of his anger, forcing Mark to submit to his will. However, one day in the middle of the day, a deafening crash was heard in the house. It was a sound that could not be ignored. Thomas, one of the neighbors, was nearby and decided to go over to see what had happened. He carefully approached the windows of the Williams house and peered inside through a crack in the curtains. What he saw shocked him. Mark was standing in the living room, amidst the broken furniture, his face distorted with anger and fear, tears streaming down his cheeks. In his hand was a piece of broken glass. Apparently, he had broken one of the windows or a vase in a fit of rage. Harold stood in front of him, completely calm and cool, as if what was happening did not matter to him. He was saying something quietly, but Thomas could not make out the words. It seemed as if Harold was trying to calm Mark down, or perhaps threaten him into submission. This was not just a quarrel. It was the manifestation of a deep conflict that had been brewing within the family for a long time. Thomas was stunned by what he saw, but he didn't know what to do. He knew that this situation was beyond the scope of a normal family quarrel, but his fear of Harold, who always seemed to be a strong and powerful man, did not allow him to intervene. He decided to leave, convincing himself that it was none of his business, but the horror of what he saw stayed with him for a long time. Mark, trapped in the house, was experiencing an incredible internal conflict. He couldn't escape from Harold, but he couldn't tolerate his manipulation and control in silence any longer. Every time he tried to resist his grandfather, the latter found new ways to break his resistance, be it emotional pressure, intimidation, or even physical force. Mark felt himself losing himself, his will to resist fading with each passing day. Harold, for his part, seemed to relish his complete control over Mark. He knew the young man depended on him for everything: housing, money, security. He used this dependency to impose his power. Increasingly, they locked themselves in the house for days at a time, never going outside. The neighbors saw them together less and less, and each time Mark showed up, he seemed more exhausted and depressed. One night, something happened that completely shocked the neighbors. Loud screams were heard in the Williams house again. But this time, they were especially piercing. and it seemed that it was not just fear. It was the scream of a person who was on the edge. The neighbors were again awakened by the noise, and some of them began to go outside to understand what was happening. Mrs. Jenkins, holding the phone with trembling hands, decided to call the police, realizing that it was impossible to endure this any longer. When the police arrived, the Williams home was silent. The officers went to the door and knocked. Harold answered, calm and composed as always. He explained that nothing out of the ordinary had happened, that his grandson Mark was simply going through a difficult time in his life and sometimes became emotional. The officers inspected the home, but finding no visible signs of violence, decided that the situation didn't require further intervention. But as they left, Mark stood in the corner of the room, his face pale and his eyes full of fear. He looked to the police as his only salvation, but the words were stuck in his throat. Harold stood next to him, his gaze cold and distant, as if he controlled every aspect of what was happening. The police left, leaving Mark a prisoner of his own fears. Several weeks had passed since the police had last visited, but nothing had changed in the Williams household, except that the atmosphere had become increasingly stifling. Each new day for Mark was a painful repetition of the same nightmare. Harold had tightened his grip on his grandson, and now it seemed that Mark did not dare take a step without his approval. The rare moments when Mark could go outside were strictly limited. The neighbors saw him less and less, and when he did appear, his appearance was increasingly disturbing. Mark no longer looked like the 19-year-old he had been a few months ago. His face was drawn, his skin was pale, and there were dark circles under his eyes from chronic lack of sleep. His figure seemed emaciated, as if he was no longer eating properly. However, despite his obvious physical deterioration, he did not speak a word, did not seek help. Mark's eyes became clouded, as if he had completely lost hope of salvation. He felt completely subordinated to Harold's will. His life had become a prison from which there was no escape. Harold, aware of his power, became more aggressive. He no longer tried to hide his rage behind the mask of a calm old man. In moments when they were alone, he revealed himself in full. The psychological pressure he exerted on Mark reached a new level. Every time Mark tried to resist or express dissatisfaction, Harold responded with threats or outright violence. In rare moments of silence, Mark felt the tension so strong that he could literally hear his heart beating in his chest. One evening, when the city had once again sunk into a quiet, almost sleepy atmosphere, a new outbreak of conflict occurred in the Williams house. Mark, overcome with despair, tried to escape. It was his first and perhaps last conscious decision in recent months. It seemed to him that if he did not leave now, he would never be able to do so again. He waited until Harold had gone to his room, and then began to pack his things. Everything he had, including the little cash he had hidden from his grandfather. But Harold seemed to sense everything that was going on in the house. He suddenly walked into Mark's room and caught him just as he was putting on his jacket and was about to run out of the house. Their eyes met, and Mark felt an icy terror grip his entire body. Harold didn't say a word, but his eyes spoke for him. It was the look of a man who would not tolerate disobedience. Mark froze, his hands shaking with fear, and he couldn't bring himself to move. Harold approached him slowly. His steps were slow but sure. Each step felt like a heavy blow to Mark's fragile psyche. He knew that there was no point in confronting his grandfather, but his instinct for self-preservation still tried to make him run. But before he could do anything, Harold grabbed his arm with such force that Mark cried out in pain. It was the first time that physical violence had been so obvious and aggressive. "You're not leaving," Harold said coldly, his voice sounding devoid of emotion. He knew Mark was broken. "You belong to me." These words sounded like a death sentence. Mark felt something inside him finally collapse. He could no longer fight. He could not resist. His will was suppressed, and his body was seized with fear. All that remained in his mind was the grim realization that he was trapped, from which there was no escape. The next few days passed in silence, but this silence was filled with a tension that could tear Mark apart. Mark no longer tried to escape. Harold did not let him go a step, controlling his every gesture, every word. Violence became a familiar part of their life. Now it was not only psychological pressure, but also physical aggression. Harold became more and more harsh and powerful with each passing day. His control over Mark seemed absolute. Neighbors continued to notice strange things, but no one dared to intervene. After several unsuccessful attempts to help or find out what was going on, people began to distance themselves. Thomas, who had once watched Mark and even tried to help, no longer came near the Williams house. Mrs. Jenkins, although she continued to monitor the situation, was also afraid to act. Everyone realized that things were taking a dangerous turn, but no one knew how to deal with it without directly endangering themselves. Meanwhile, Harold felt like a winner. He believed that he had Mark completely subdued, that he would never try to leave again. However, inside the young man, a small flame of resistance still smoldered, albeit deeply hidden under layers of fear and despair. This flame, however weak, would soon flare up when the situation reached its peak, and Mark would be faced with a choice: to submit completely or to take one last desperate step towards freedom. A step that would mark the beginning of the end of their terrible story. Winter had blanketed the small town in a thick layer of snow, and life seemed to slow down. The streets were empty, and people were spending their time indoors as usual. However, events were beginning to happen in the Williams house that once again attracted the attention of the neighbors. Mark had suddenly disappeared. The first thing the locals, especially Mrs. Jenkins, noticed was the absence of the light in his room, which usually remained on until late in the evening. A day passed, then another, but Mark was not seen. He did not go out, did not go to the shop, and did not communicate with the neighbors, which, although usual for him, seemed especially alarming this time. Mrs. Jenkins, who always watched from across the road, felt deeply uneasy. At first, she tried to reassure herself, assuming that Mark was simply gone for a while, perhaps to visit relatives or friends. However, her intuition told her that something had happened in the Williams house. A few days later, rumors began to circulate. People began to whisper among themselves, discussing possible reasons for his disappearance. No one knew where Mark was, and even stranger, no one had seen him for several days. In a town where almost everyone knew everyone else, this was unsettling. The unusual silence around the Williams house only increased suspicion. When one of the neighbors decided to visit Harold and find out if everything was okay, he reported with complete confidence that Mark had gone to his mother. On the surface, everything seemed plausible. Harold was calm and confident in his words. But for those who knew the family better, such a step was unexpected. Mark rarely communicated with his mother, and their relationship was, to put it mildly, tense. Moreover, no one saw a car or other signs that Mark had really left the city. Mrs. Jenkins began to watch the house closely. She did not believe Harold's words and felt that something was wrong. Those terrible moments when she saw them in the abandoned barn, moments of screams in the night and fear in Mark's eyes, came to her mind. Every day her concern grew. She tried to ask other neighbors, but most did not want to interfere. In small towns, they always tried to avoid other people's business, unless the situation directly affected them. After a few more days, suspicions turned into real alarm. People began to discuss what had really happened. Locals began to ask questions. Why did Mark leave so suddenly? Why did no one see him leave? Why did Harold, who used to go out often, now avoid communicating with his neighbors? Mark was like a vanished shadow. A young man who was seen less and less on the street now seemed to have evaporated. With each passing day, the atmosphere around the Williams house grew thicker, and suspicions that something terrible was hiding in this house became more and more obvious. The authorities had not yet intervened. Local police, like many residents, believed that young people often ran away from home or spent time away from their families, especially if difficult events were happening in their lives. Moreover, after the first police visit, everything seemed normal. However, this did not calm those who continued to watch the house. Suspicions grew, like a growing whisper in the city, and while many chose not to interfere, some began to think that something serious needed to be done. Soon, Mark's absence would become too obvious to ignore, and the truth hidden behind these walls would finally come out. When Mark's disappearance became too noticeable, the town's community could no longer remain silent. As weeks passed without any news of the young man, the excitement among the locals grew. Questions began to grow louder, especially from those who had known Mark since childhood. His complete disappearance seemed increasingly suspicious, and more people began to contact the authorities, demanding answers. The local police could no longer ignore these complaints. The officers were forced to launch a formal investigation. They first went to the Williams home to talk to Harold. He met them with the same calm and confidence that always inspired confidence in others. Harold repeated his version of events. Mark had gone to his mother. He assured the police that this was his personal decision and that the young man was fine. At first, this seemed logical. The police had no reason not to trust the respected old man. However, as the days turned into weeks, police began to realize that something was wrong. When officers tried to contact Mark's mother, they discovered that she had not seen her son for several years and had no contact with him. This news became a turning point in the investigation. Harold's story began to crumble, and officers began to dig deeper into the family's history. The police noticed oddities in Harold's behavior and his relationship with Mark. Neighbors who had previously remained silent began to talk. Mrs. Jenkins recalled what she had seen in the abandoned barn, the screams that had come from the house at night, and the strange bruises on Mark's body that she had once noticed. These testimonies only increased the police's suspicions. They now realized that there was much more to the story than they had originally thought. The police decided to conduct a more thorough search of the Williams home. Harold tried to act as if everything was under control, but his composure was beginning to show cracks. The officers examined every corner of the house, trying to find anything that could shed light on Mark's disappearance. At first, everything seemed normal, but the more they delved into the investigation, the clearer it became that something was hidden behind the familiar facade of the house. The ordinary rooms, at first glance, did not contain anything suspicious, but one of the bedrooms, the one that belonged to Mark, attracted their attention. It looked strangely abandoned. Things were scattered, and the bed was covered in a layer of dust, as if no one had touched it for several weeks. It seemed that Mark left this place in a hurry, without even having time to collect his personal belongings. However, Harold himself continued to assure that Mark simply went to his mother and everything was fine. The police began to analyze the neighbors' statements. Mrs. Jenkins's story about hearing screams and seeing strange scenes in the street only increased suspicions. It was decided to expand the search radius for Mark and also to examine the surrounding areas. It was then that a real tragedy loomed on the horizon. A few days after the active search began, the police came across an old, abandoned barn that had long been forgotten by residents. This barn was located just a few miles from the Williams house and looked like an abandoned, unused place. However, one of the officers, remembering the words of Mrs. Jenkins, decided to examine it. It was here that the first shocking evidence was discovered. There were traces of blood on the floor of the barn, now dried but still visible. A musty silence hung in the air, paralyzing everyone who entered. This place immediately became a key focus of the investigation. The police realized that something terrible had happened here, but there was still no trace of Mark himself. Now the investigation had become a real hunt for the truth. The police organized a large-scale search, attracting more and more resources. The officers understood that each new step brought them closer to solving the mystery, but they could not yet say for sure what had happened to Mark. The barn was the beginning of a terrible chain of events that would soon reveal the terrible truth. Several weeks after the active search for Mark began, the police were finally getting closer to solving the mystery of what had happened to the young man. Rumors continued to spread throughout the town, and residents could no longer ignore the dark speculation that Mark might have been murdered. Tensions grew with each passing day, and the Williams home gradually became an object of fear and suspicion. One morning, in an area near an abandoned barn where traces of blood had been found earlier, the search party came across what they feared most: the body of a young man, partially covered in a layer of dirt and dry leaves. The police realized that it could be Mark. The clothes the body was found in matched the description of what Mark had been wearing the last time he was seen. The condition of the body was terrible. It had clearly lain there for weeks, perhaps longer. It was obvious to the naked eye that the death had been violent. The body was wrapped in an old blanket, dirty and stained. The police immediately sealed the crime scene to preserve all possible evidence. A detailed investigation of the crime scene began. Forensic experts worked for hours, collecting every piece of information that could help understand what happened in the last moments of Mark's life. The police realized that this was no longer just a disappearance. It was a murder. The news that Mark's body had been found quickly spread throughout the town. Residents were shocked and devastated. Many of them suspected that something terrible had happened to the young man, but no one was prepared for such a brutal truth. People began to discuss possible motives and suspect Harold. Those who knew him best could not believe that a man who had been a respected member of society for many years could be involved in such a terrible crime. Within days of the body's discovery, an intensive investigation began. The police knew that Harold was the key figure in the case. However, they could not rush to accuse him without sufficient evidence. Now his every word, every action became the object of close attention. Investigators discovered that Mark's body was hidden in close proximity to the very barn that had raised suspicions a few weeks earlier. It was a place where witnesses said Mark and Harold had often been together. This detail only increased suspicions that Mark had not died by accident, but that his death had been the result of prolonged and brutal violence. The forensic examination confirmed that Mark died from multiple injuries. It was soon discovered that the blanket in which his body was wrapped belonged to the Williams house. This evidence became the most important one implicating Harold in the murder. The police began to carefully analyze Harold's behavior over the past months. Neighbors who had previously remained silent or were afraid to say anything now began to open up to investigators. Mrs. Jenkins recalled all her observations: the screams at night, the bruises on Mark's body, his depressed state. It all built up to a terrible picture of what was happening in the Williams house. The police soon received permission to search the house again. During this search, they found several items that further increased their suspicions. Bloody stains on old clothes hidden in the garage, signs of a struggle in one of the rooms, and many of Mark's personal belongings that would have been with him if he had actually gone to live with his mother. All of this evidence pointed to one thing: Mark had never left the house voluntarily. The police knew they were getting closer to solving the mystery, but they still had to figure out the motives and details of how it all happened. Harold remained calm, but his composure seemed increasingly artificial. Behind his outward reserve was a man whose secrets were now out in the open for all to see. Meanwhile, the town was in a tense mood. People were discussing the story on every corner, trying to understand how something so horrible could have happened. Many wondered what had driven Harold to kill his own grandson. But the answer to that question remained a mystery for now. The discovery of the body was a turning point in the investigation. The police now had sufficient grounds to formally press charges against Harold, and although he continued to deny everything, evidence found at the crime scene and in the house told a different story. The mystery that had long been hidden behind the walls of the Williams home was finally beginning to unravel. With Mark's body discovered, and the evidence gathered, the investigation began to move inexorably toward its climax. The police could no longer ignore the weight of evidence pointing to Harold. Everyone now knew that there was a dark truth behind his calm exterior. The question that everyone from investigators to neighbors was asking was, what exactly drove an elderly man to murder his grandson? The case against Harold hinged on several key pieces of evidence. First, the blanket in which Mark's body had been wrapped belonged to his home. This fact was irrefutable proof that Mark had not left the house as Harold had claimed. Second, the signs of a struggle in Mark's bedroom indicated that he had attempted to resist before he died. Finally, eyewitness accounts that had at first seemed merely suspicious now took on new force, becoming important details in the investigation. Mrs. Jenkins, as a key witness, presented her observations to investigators. She recalled Harold and Mark's strange behavior in recent months, their frequent visits to the barn, which had now become a crime scene. Her accounts of screams coming from the house at night, strange bruises on Mark's body, and his avoidance of other people were part of a larger picture of violence that was taking place behind closed doors. Her accounts were matched by the testimony of other neighbors who had finally come forward with their suspicions. When police searched the house again, they found another key piece of evidence: bloodstains found on old clothes hidden in the garage, which forensic tests confirmed belonged to Mark. This finally linked Harold to the crime. With each passing day, investigators became more convinced that Mark had been the victim of prolonged abuse at the hands of his grandfather, which ultimately led to his tragic death. In the face of these revelations, Harold continued to insist on his innocence. He assured everyone who would listen that Mark had indeed gone to his mother, that he himself had nothing to do with his grandson's disappearance. However, his confidence gradually weakened. The police noticed that with each day of interrogation and investigation, his behavior became more and more tense. He was no longer the cool man who could once calmly look his neighbors in the eye. Now he avoided direct questions, gave contradictory answers, and seemed to be confused in his own stories. Meanwhile, the town began to actively discuss the case. People gathered in local cafes, on the streets and in shops, exchanging news about the progress of the investigation. For most residents, it was obvious that Harold was guilty. Some of them were shocked that this respected elderly man, whom many considered a role model, was involved in such a heinous crime. But there were those who still could not believe in his guilt. They believed that it could be a misunderstanding, or that someone else was behind the crime. But the facts spoke for themselves. Ultimately, under pressure from the evidence and witnesses, prosecutors decided to file formal charges against Harold. He was charged with first-degree murder, as well as with committing long-term violence against his grandson. These charges meant that he would face a long trial in which the truth about his actions would come to light. Harold was arrested in his own home. When the police came to him with a warrant, he offered no resistance. Neighbors watched as he was led out of the house in handcuffs. His face, which had always looked impassive, now expressed something between fear and despair. The moment became a symbol of how quickly the illusion of outward well-being and respect can collapse when the truth comes out. After Harold's arrest, the Williams house fell into complete silence. It became a symbol of the horror that lurked behind the facade of normal life. People who had once respected Harold were now afraid to even walk past his house. Every new fact that emerged during the investigation only confirmed that Mark was a victim of violence hidden from prying eyes. Harold faced a long trial, and the town had to deal with the consequences of its most respected citizen being implicated in one of the most shocking crimes ever committed in this quiet corner of Oklahoma. After Harold's arrest, the city was plunged into an atmosphere of horror and distrust. No one could believe that a quiet and respectable old man was involved in such a monstrous crime. The Williams house now became a symbol of this tragedy, and many residents tried to avoid even the mere mention of his name. However, the investigation continued, and with each passing day, more and more shocking details about the lives of Mark and his grandfather emerged. Once the police had filed formal charges, the process of gathering all possible evidence that could prove Harold's guilt began. Investigators conducted numerous interviews, analyzed the evidence found, compared witnesses' statements, and checked every little fact. One of the key details was that most of the witnesses began to remember details that they had previously considered insignificant, but now fit into the overall picture of violence hidden behind the walls of the house. The police worked non-stop, realizing that this was not just a murder investigation. It was an exposé of Harold's entire life and the monstrous actions that had been hidden behind the mask of an ordinary pensioner. Their main goal was not just to prove his guilt, but also to restore justice for Mark, who had lived in a nightmare for many months or even years. Investigators suspected that the abuse could have continued for many years, and now they had to find out how many more secrets the house was hiding. The day after Harold's arrest, the Williams home was raided again. The police, now realizing that what had happened was not a spontaneous crime, began looking for additional evidence that might explain Harold's motives. They examined everything from Mark's personal belongings to old family photos and records that might shed light on their relationship. In one of the rooms, they found an old diary that belonged to Mark. It contained entries he had made as a teenager when he began living with his grandfather. On the first pages, the diary looked like a typical teenage musing about life, but the further the investigators read, the darker the descriptions became. Mark began to write down his experiences and fears associated with his grandfather. He wrote about how Harold was gradually turning his life into a nightmare, about the pressure and fear he experienced every day. These recordings became an important piece of evidence in the case. Now the police had not only the testimony of outside observers, but also confirmation from Mark himself that his life was full of pain and violence. These recordings completed the picture of what was happening behind the closed doors of the Williams home. For investigators and prosecutors, this became further evidence that Harold was not just cruel, but also a skilled manipulator who hid his true intentions for many years. Meanwhile, Harold's arrest became the talk of the town. People who had previously known him only as a respected citizen now could not believe that he was capable of such atrocities. Many neighbors, especially those who had once been close to the Williams family, began to recall strange moments from the past that had previously seemed insignificant, but now filled them with horror. Many in the town were in shock after learning the truth about what had happened. They now knew that Mark had been a prisoner in his own home for a long time, and that Harold, a man they trusted and respected, was a monster capable of terrible acts. The town gradually began to divide between those who wanted to forget what had happened and those who demanded justice for Mark. Harold did not resist during his arrest. He was cool, although there was something alarming in his gaze now. The investigators watched him carefully, trying to understand what he was feeling and thinking at that moment. However, his face remained inscrutable, as if he had hoped to the last moment that he would be able to escape punishment. But the weight of evidence and testimony was so great that no one doubted his guilt anymore. After his arrest, Harold was sent to the local jail to await trial. His life was now in the hands of the law, and the entire town was watching the case unfold. This case was more than just a local tragedy. It revealed the brutal truth that even the quietest and most prosperous families can hide terrifying secrets. The investigation continued, and each new fact made the picture clearer. Harold could no longer hide behind the mask of a respected old man. Now he was accused of one of the most notorious and horrific crimes, which shocked not only his family, but the entire community. After Harold's arrest, the investigation gained momentum. The evidence collected by the police became more and more substantial and detailed. However, there were still many questions that the investigators were trying to find answers to. The police were not only trying to prove Harold's guilt, but also to reconstruct the chronology of events, to understand how exactly he was able to hide his crimes for many years and what was really happening in the Williams house. One of the most important tasks of the investigators was to establish how long the abuse against Mark had been going on. The fact that his life had ended in such a tragic way indicated a long period of abuse of power and psychological terror to which Mark had been subjected. The testimony of neighbors, especially Mrs. Jenkins, confirmed that the last months of Mark's life had been particularly difficult. However, the investigators believed that Harold's abuse had begun much earlier. The diary that was found by Mark became a key element of the investigation. Its pages revealed terrible details about what the young man had been going through during the last years of his life. In the entries, Mark wrote about his feelings of helplessness, about his fear of his grandfather, who manipulated him, threatened him, and punished him for the slightest attempt to resist. These entries helped investigators build a picture of the long-term violence that took place in the house. Mark also described wanting to escape, but each time he attempted to break free of Harold's control, his grandfather would increase the pressure. In one entry, Mark detailed how he once tried to leave the house, but Harold intercepted him at the door and threatened that if he left, no one would protect him, and that he would be alone against the world. The fear of isolation and loss of support, even if that support was toxic and destructive, broke Mark. This evidence became an important part of the indictment against Harold. Investigators could now prove that Mark was not just a victim of random violence, but was subjected to systematic and deliberate abuse by his grandfather. This information also became key to understanding Harold's motives. He sought to completely control his grandson's life, not even considering the idea of Mark leaving him. In parallel with the analysis of diary entries, investigators also examined electronic data messages, emails, and other digital traces that could shed light on the relationships between Mark and his circle. It turned out that Mark tried to contact friends and other relatives, but his messages were full of fear and despair. He trusted almost no one and felt trapped. The evidence they collected and the testimony of neighbors helped the police to build a clear chronology of events. They realized that in recent months, Mark had become increasingly aware of his helplessness and dependence on his grandfather. He had begun to resist, which led to an escalation of violence on Harold's part. This resistance became the catalyst for the conflict that eventually led to tragedy. Investigators concluded that Harold, realizing that he was losing control over Mark, decided to act drastically. Mark's death was not the result of a random outburst of anger. It was a conscious and deliberate act aimed at finally suppressing any attempt by his grandson to free himself. Harold, as his subsequent testimony showed, viewed Mark not as an independent person, but as his property, which he managed at his own discretion. The key moment in the investigation was the night Mark finally disappeared. The police found out that they had had an argument that evening. Mark again stated his desire to leave, and Harold, feeling that he was losing control, hit him. From that moment on, events unfolded rapidly. Harold took Mark to the barn, the very one that became the key evidence in the case. There, isolated from prying eyes, the murder took place. Mark's body was hidden in a hurry, and Harold himself returned home, trying to act as if nothing had happened. As the investigation drew to a close, it became clear that this case was far more complex than initially thought. This was not a simple crime of fear or a random outburst of violence. It was a long and torturous story of abuse of power, manipulation, and psychological pressure that led to a terrible tragedy. Now Harold was about to stand trial, charged with first-degree murder and years of abuse against his grandson. Investigators and prosecutors prepared for the trial, knowing that the truth about what had happened in the Williams home would finally be revealed. The trial of Harold Williams began several months after the investigation was completed. The entire country followed the case as it gained widespread public attention. The media covered every step of the investigation, and residents of the small town where the tragedy occurred were glued to the news. For many, the case became a symbol of how monstrous secrets can hide behind the facade of ordinary life. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, locals, and the victims' families had all gathered to see the jury deliver its verdict in a case that had shaken not just a small town, but an entire country. Harold sat in the dock, his expression still cool. But beneath that calm there was now fear. He knew his plan had been completely destroyed, his secrets exposed. The prosecution presented a case against Harold with ironclad logic and irrefutable evidence. The first charge was a history of long-term abuse against Mark. Prosecutors read Mark's diary entries in which he described how his grandfather psychologically and physically controlled his life, forced him to obey, and threatened him if he disobeyed. These entries became powerful evidence that Harold not only controlled Mark, but systematically abused him, breaking his will. Prosecutors also presented testimony from neighbors, which became an important part of the prosecution's case. Mrs. Jenkins, as the main witness, spoke of screams at night, of Mark's strange behavior and bruises. Her testimony supported the theory that the violence in the Williams home had been going on for a long time. Other neighbors, who had previously been afraid to speak out, now shared their observations, adding more and more details to the overall picture. The key moment in the trial was the autopsy of the circumstances of the murder. The prosecutor's office presented all the evidence found in the abandoned barn and in the Williams house. Traces of blood, Mark's clothes, the blanket in which his body was wrapped. This evidence finally linked Harold to the crime. Forensic experts confirmed that Mark was killed by strangulation, and the injuries on his body indicated a prolonged resistance before death. It was a brutal and deliberate massacre. Harold tried to defend himself by claiming that Mark's death was an accident. He claimed that he did not mean to kill his grandson, that they had allegedly had an argument and it all happened in a fit of rage. However, his version of events did not stand up to criticism under the weight of the evidence. Prosecutors clearly showed that the murder was planned and carefully thought out, as Harold even tried to hide the body to avoid responsibility. The trial also heard testimony from psychological experts who confirmed that Harold's behavior was typical of manipulators and abusers. He slowly broke Mark's psyche, isolated him from the outside world, forced him to live by his own rules, threatened and humiliated him. This testimony reinforced the accusation that Harold acted deliberately and systematically, gradually destroying his grandson's personality. The trial lasted for weeks. Each new session brought more and more horrific details about Mark's life and the cruelty he had suffered. In the end, Harold's defense was unconvincing. When it came time to reach a verdict, the jury had little doubt of his guilt. At the final hearing, the judge read the guilty verdict. Harold was found guilty of first-degree murder and of long-term abuse and neglect of his grandson. The sentence was harsh: life in prison without parole. It was the final word in a case that had shocked not only a small town but the entire country. When the verdict was announced, a tense silence fell over the courtroom. No one expressed sympathy for Harold. For everyone, he had become the embodiment of the evil that had been hidden behind the mask of an ordinary old man for too long. Many who had known him all his life now felt only disgust and hatred. This man had ruined his grandson's life and shocked the community that trusted him. Harold, sitting in the dock, showed no particular emotion. He was still trying to maintain a semblance of calm, but his eyes betrayed the realization that his life was completely ruined. Now he was facing life in prison, and he would never be released again. His attempt to hide his crimes had failed. The truth had come out, and he had paid for it with his whole life. The townspeople began to slowly recover from the horror. The Williams home, empty and abandoned, now stood as a grim reminder that even the most innocent of facades can hide the most terrible secrets. The story of Mark Williams will forever be remembered by those who knew him as a tragic example of cruelty and violence that went unnoticed for so long. After the verdict, life in the small town slowly began to return to normal. But the traces of the tragedy associated with the Williams family remained in everyone's memories. Harold Williams, now a convicted felon, went to serve his life sentence, and although he was no longer physically present in the town, his dark legacy continued to poison the atmosphere of this once peaceful place. The Williams house, once neat and quiet, now became a symbol of the horror that lurked behind its walls. None of the locals dared to even approach it. The house was sealed, and there was a for sale sign, but despite many offers, no one dared to buy it. Rumors that the house was cursed began to spread among the residents, and it gradually became overgrown with weeds, reminding everyone of the terrible events that took place here. Local residents, especially those who knew Mark and Harold personally, had different reactions to what happened. Mrs. Jenkins, the main witness, could not shake off the feeling of guilt for a long time about not having been able to prevent the tragedy. Although she reported her suspicions to the police, she was tormented by the thought that she could have done more, intervened earlier, or warned someone else. She went out less and less and tried not to remember what she had seen in the last year of Mark's life. Many of the residents who had previously respected Harold felt betrayed. He had been a role model for the older generation, a man who seemed to embody family values and caring for his grandson. Now they could not accept that the man they had known for so many years was a monster. This duality had a profound effect on the trust within the community. People began to trust each other less, and some even feared that other families might harbor similar dark secrets. Mark's death was more than just a family tragedy. It changed the entire community. The school he attended erected a small plaque in his memory. Teachers and classmates who had previously ignored his isolation now understood what was behind his strange behavior. Many remembered Mark with a deep sadness for not having seen what was happening to him in time and not having helped him. His name became a symbol of a sacrifice that had long gone unnoticed. Meetings and gatherings began to be held around the city to discuss issues of domestic violence and child abuse. Psychologists and social workers arrived to help residents cope with the aftermath of what had happened. Mark's story caused a wave of awareness of how often violence can occur in the most unexpected places and go unnoticed by others. People began to look more closely at their neighbors, trying to spot signs of possible violence that they might have previously ignored. For many who followed the trial, the case was a personal tragedy. For those on the outside, reading the news and watching the reports, it was a horrifying realization that something like this could happen anywhere and to anyone. The story of Mark and his grandfather became an example of how long-term, hidden evil can ruin a person's life if it is not stopped in time. In the end, the Williams family story became a warning to all. The town was never the same, and the house where these horrors took place remained a silent witness to the tragedy. And although time has gradually blurred the memory of the details, the pain of loss and the bitterness of what happened will never completely disappear. The story of Mark Williams has forever remained in the hearts of those who lived around him. His suffering and death became a lesson to the entire city about how evil can lurk even in the most familiar and ordinary places. And the name Harold Williams became a symbol of betrayal and cruelty that went unnoticed for a long time. This incident changed not only the lives of individuals, but also the entire community, which has become more attentive to its neighbors and to what happens behind closed doors.